As a priest of the St. Paul Minneapolis Archdiocese, I've witnessed the service of the church by Sister Katarina Schuth these past 27 years. For the past 27 years, Katarina helped the seminarians at our seminary with programs and support, preparing them for pastoral service. Pope Francis likes to urge bishops, priests, and deacons to smell like the sheep they pastor. Many of us in this room know what that means and have an aversion to certain forms of deodorant. Sister Katarina knows that the preaching of the gospel happens when the preachers honestly know themselves and know the environment and who they are preaching to. She is known as a leading figure in the fields of pastoral theology and the sociology of religion. Given Katarina's years of experience on the interface of the culture and the evangelization mission of the church, I look forward with you to her observations about effective evangelization of younger Catholics. Katarina, you are very welcomed. As Katarina approaches, everyone should have Katarina's handout. Does anyone not have that? Okay, there's a couple people back there. Just keep your hands up and we will get some handouts to you.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for those kind words. About 2 weeks ago, I just got back from a wonderful pilgrimage in Israel led by Father Don Sr., the Passionist priest who is such a wonderful writer on Scripture. And he seems to know about everything about the Holy Land. And he told one story that I thought would be applicable. Herod Agrippa, the one who was reigning at the time of Christ's death, was someone who loved to receive praise. And so one of the prophets told Herod that if he kept on being praised, he would get worms. And so I hope that the kind of praise, Kevin, that you heaped upon me will not cause that result. But thank you for those kind words. It's really a great honor to be among people with whom I feel so at home. It's the first time I've spoken to a group of priests where I feel slightly overdressed. I'm really grateful to be here, and as a Franciscan, it sort of fits in with our heritage and with our spirituality. We were taught from the time we were novices on that St. Francis had great respect for priests, and that in our lives we were to have the same. And so I've always carried that with me, and never expecting that I would be in the kind of work that I am now have been in the last 35 years, that is working with seminaries and the faculties of seminaries and seminarians. So I carry that with me, and I want to tell you how much it means to me and to so many thousands and thousands of people that there are priests like you that are serving us. So thank you so very much for that. I also want to mention that tonight, as I was having supper and walking back, a number of people said to me, well, you know, don't be too hard on us now. Are you going to give us a test afterwards? You know, the little comments. And I said, well, no, but I do have this little confession to make. I think this is a time for confession. Think of all of the forgiveness I'll get. I taught 7th and 8th grade for a year and a half The half would give you a clue that I wasn't really good at it. And one day, this 8th grade class was particularly rambunctious. So I said, I will not speak with you today. I'll write your assignments on the board and just do your work, and that's the end of it. So that went on for an hour or two. And suddenly Richard in the corner raised his hand and said, "Sister, sister." I just ignored him. So he stood up and said, "Sister," and I ignored him. So he stood in front of the desk and he said, "Oh, sister, please." And then he came around to the side, and this was when I was wearing a full habit, and he picked up the side of my veil and he said, "Sister, are you in there?" So I hope I am in there tonight. So what I will do is to discuss a very important topic, that is about the opportunities and responsibilities that we have to enliven the faith life of our youth and young adults. I will discuss the situation in two parts, as is indicated on that one-page handout you have, and is shown also on the first slide here. So the first part, who are they? And I'm taking the descriptions from many writers and also researchers, as well as parents and families and experiences that I've had. So the cultural characteristics and the spiritual qualities. I'll say something somewhat brief about each. And then what can we do with them given who they are? So that's when I'll talk about approaches to evangelization. I will be using several names for the group that we're speaking about: younger Catholics, millennials, youth and young adults, and basically we're speaking of those who are about between the ages of 16 or maybe 18 to about 30 or 35. So it's that age group that is the subject of the talk tonight. I will not be talking as much about the terrific research that was sponsored by St. Mary's Press and that Kara did, the book called Going, Going, Gone. I think our St. Mary's people here tonight, at least I know they're here in the display group. That is terrific research. However, it deals with those who have decided that they are no longer self-identified as Catholic. And so it's research about people who have left the church already, and that's not who we will be focusing on tonight, but rather about people who are hanging in one way or another, and we'll talk about that one way or another, and that we can bring closer to Christ and bring into the church more deeply as we try to work well with them. But it's to acknowledge that wonderful research and to know why they have left, and I can say more about that in question and answer if somebody would like to ask about that. But I will be talking about those who are still either deeply involved in the church, or sort of middle involvement, or barely at all. But these are the ones that we want to help as much as we can. So my objective is to describe them and then consider how we might invite them more deeply into the faith. That is, overcoming barriers and actively encouraging their participation. And so that's the focus that I will be using now. And so this is the beginning of that. And what I want to emphasize is that millennials are not all the same. Young adults are not all the same. I'm naming a number of things here, like the economic and educational differences, the spiritual preferences, and their ethnic and racial backgrounds. You know some of those distinctions already. And it's important to keep in mind that all of them, or some of each of them, may be in our parish communities, and they may need different kinds of attention. The other thing is, on the older end of this group, and perhaps not on the very oldest end, there are those who are married, and those married with children have very different needs. So it's a very complex situation, and it takes a good deal of study of who it is that you are ministering to in your particular parishes. So now, a few of the characteristics from a cultural point of view. And I will be generalizing, trying to distinguish one from another, kind of the extremes maybe, or at least two sides of it. So the first is about the general feeling that the young people of this age grew up in a way that made them feel special, sheltered. They required high maintenance. They're used to having that. That is, if they came from families who were well off. We'll talk about the others in a moment. They were planned and wanted, supervised, protected, directed. They expected attention, and they don't suffer well the loss of any kind of loss or being deprived or even delayed. I think an example of that I have learned at the University of St. Thomas, where I taught undergraduates for 26 years and then seminarians for the same length of time. And several faculty members on the university undergrad faculty have told me about giving a test, handing the test back, and some students didn't do well. By the time the faculty member got back to his or her office, there were already calls from parents saying, "Why did you do this to my child?" They are very special. They're very important. They know you didn't correct the papers correctly. Well, I guess college level you might expect that, especially of the younger ones. But I was shocked one day when I gave back papers and the final grade in my pastoral ministry class, and I got back to my office, and shortly after, the mother of one of the seminarians called, and she said, "I understand that you gave my son an A-, and you know, he's really a much better student than I'm a teacher and I know. And moreover," she said, "this last paper, he was just excellent. He was better than any of the others." I don't know how she knew that. And so I said, "Well, you know, I appreciate how much you pay attention to your son's work, really." And so I said, "But he skipped a third of the paper that was required." "Well, oh, I think you misunderstood." I mean, she argued considerably, and this young man is now a priest, and he's having his own arguments, let us say. But that is the kind of demands that young people can make on us. So you think, okay, so we're supposed to minister to them. Yes, that's part of what we do. But not all of them are like that, and most of them are not. But they do need a lot of direction, more so than in the past. On the other hand, there are those who come from families with serious relational problems and other issues. I mean, right now, look at what's happening at the border. Think of those children and what they face. Think of those young parents who are part of our group of concern here, young adults suffering with the loss of their children. Others are deprived of educational opportunities. They're unconcerned parents sometimes. They reside with a single parents and because of divorce. So that group is different from that previous slide where they got all the attention in the world. Both kinds of young people exist in most parishes, and you know your parishes well. Some have a whole lot more of that of either kind, one or the other, and they can be of great help to each other too. Some are self-assured, they're goal-oriented, they know what they want, they're hopeful about the future, and some expect that to happen, and others have the great hope that it might, and their hopes are sometimes dashed. Then we have the problems that someone mentioned this afternoon about opioid addictions and many of the drug problems and other relational problems and crime and so on that we have in our society because people just have not had a chance. Many of them are pressured, and that attitude of, I don't have a lot of time to do just whatever, so get to the point. In other words, don't talk too long is kind of their message. However, they like to talk quite long at times. Then another factor deals with their attitudes, relationships, and conformity. They value relationships sometimes, but think about this. Half of all Americans of that age group talk with their parents every day. And I mentioned this to a few people on the plane, actually, and some other places, and they said, "Oh yeah, my son calls me every day, or my daughter calls every day." That's quite a wonderful thing. They enjoy almost continuous contact, which can mean that they are not becoming very independent. Yet, many ignore the person next to them, experiencing only virtual contact. And you see the family at the table with everybody with their machines. And I think that walking across campus sometimes, I say somebody says hello, and I say hello, and then I realize they're talking on the phone. And that they're walking with each other, both on cell phones. There is a serious lack of interaction sometimes among young people, and if we expect them then to be involved in a parish and be helpful to others, they also have to learn that very basic kind of relational event. Some are team-oriented, many of them, in fact. They like being part of a team, wearing uniforms. They like to belong. And a good community, they say, is having unity and working together. Very true. The bad thing is not working together or working against each other. I think we need to remember these phrases when we put together parish programs. They want to feel a sense of belonging. They want to feel that it's important for them to be in that parish. We'll look at that more specifically toward the end of the presentation, but that's a factor. And then sometimes they are conventional. They tend to view some adults, at least, as hypocrites and less moral, and they have good reason for that at times. And they have a negative reaction to the sexual behavior and scandals that have happened, as we well know, in so many different places. And then, given the current unrest and political environment, this is an exaggerated factor that they want things to be more settled, and this is quite a disturbing time for many young people. And they believe that the major causes of world problems are selfishness and lack of respect for authority and laws. Well, the selfishness I can certainly get. Sometimes the lack of respect for authority and laws depends on the authority and the laws, and I'm sure that that will be sorted out more in time to come. They're similar, the Catholics are similar to their counterparts. They tend to be consumerists, and they want lots of material things. For many, it's essential or very important for them to be rich. Whether they're poor or well off now, they would like to be rich. And this, I thought, was an interesting thing. They are half as likely as Protestants, their own age, to say that the Bible or religious leaders have a great deal of influence on how they think about money. That probably would be an interesting parish topic to gather young people around that value. And then they are usually open to diversity and attentive to gender equality. On the whole, that's true, and it's bothersome for those who are having a struggle with the church, feeling, for example, that women should be ordained. I think it's 87%, that follows in a slide, of young people feel that women should be able to be ordained. Well, you know, it's probably not going to happen. Well, let's let that go. Who knows what's going to happen? But anyway, that's something that bothers many of them, and it's how do we talk about to them in the meantime? And then the diversity, they're open to diversity as long as it doesn't interfere too much with their own way of thinking. And so it is not, it's not all positive. But I want to present kind of an even-handed picture here, that there are many, many good things about them. There are things that bother them, and characteristics that we have to be aware of as we try to work effectively with them. So I have now a few reflection questions which are on your sheets that you have received, and you need not turn to them now. Dan tells me that when I finish, you'll have about 15 or 20 minutes for discussion at tables, and then I'll take some questions if you would like. So just that you'll have those questions in hand, and they relate to the part that I just did. The second part of this B of part one is about the spiritual qualities. And again, there are generalizations, and they obviously, not everything applies to everybody. So the spiritual qualities, some are satisfied with institutions, including the church. Some are intolerant of the institutions and those who lead them. And some believe they can and will change institutions. How they will change them is hugely different, depending on who they are. So looking at that, those satisfied with institutions, millennials are significantly more likely than the older generations to be satisfied with church leadership, maybe until recently, and I think there's some concerns now given a lot of things that have gone on, and to say that the church is meeting their spiritual needs. Well, they don't have very many spiritual needs that they are asking about, so perhaps that's why they think they're being met. However, the recent church scandals have made them more skeptical, but let's say 10 years ago or so, they definitely had that greater respect for institutions. And this kind of follows those intolerant of institutions and of those who lead them. Again, the Generation X, the older generations are more likely like that. The younger ones will accept, either they accept the institutional church and support its decrees and policies fully and totally, or they totally ignore and actively reject them. So it's not worth discussing, they would say. The ones who accept the institutions and say that we shouldn't be arguing about the policies and decrees of the church would say there's nothing to discuss. We know what the truth is. So there are two reasons not to discuss, and yet some of them really would deepen their faith if they had a chance to ask questions. So that's those who may not be too tolerant of institutions. And then some of them that they believe that they can and will change institutions. And the change, especially among seminarians in the last 20 years or so that I've been teaching, they really believe they'll change the church when perhaps some of you and me are beyond active ministry. And putting it nicely. So that they'll simply eliminate dissent and it will be much more pleasant. There's that group. And they tend to agree with the narrow interpretation of rules, and they see that older generations really don't have that kind of respect. So that position that they hold one way or the other, the ethnic and lifestyle preferences, their past experiences make a big difference in how they feel that way. The lesson perhaps is to focus more on the Gospels and on Jesus as a model and not on the institution and how it operates. Some of them get much too involved in that, again, especially those who are preparing for ministry, both lay and seminarians. The second aspect of their spiritual qualities concern relationship with others. Many youth and young adults have the characteristics of valuing community service and volunteering, different motives. The motives can be either quite self-centered. They're doing it because it puts them in favor with people they want to be accepted by, or it is an assignment in a college or high schools even. For confirmation, for example, you have to volunteer, you have to do certain service projects. Or it may be an altruistic appeal that's based on their own commitments and beliefs. And those are the ones that we really want to help with their attitudes to develop community. Some value community, and many of them, it depends on the quality of the community, of course. And this love for community may relate to the fact that they don't have individual relationships that are very clear, that there have been breakdowns, and it may arise from participation in a group that they really liked. So there are different reasons. So therefore, they need to feel welcome in the church by staff and other parishioners, as well as by the pastors and priests who make an effort to include them. That effort in inviting, I was speaking to a couple of priests from nearby dioceses to the Twin Cities, and one of their men was ordained, or will be ordained in a few days, and I said, be sure to invite him into your circles. I think that's one of the things that happens with the community idea. The younger ones get ordained, they're very different in their attitudes sometimes, and older priests, pastors many pastors, and you probably some of you feel the same, really don't want a young associate that they have to argue with. And yet I think if right off you started bringing them into your own life and they respect it, how could they not respect what you do, having heard just those few men who are going to run for being on the leadership team. Just think of the things that you've done in your life. Somehow I don't think they understand that very clearly. That really has to be said over and over, especially to seminarians, but also to other people, to have a sense of what they have benefited from. And then the service orientation, that goes along with a little bit with the idea of their other relationships and volunteering. So they have a desire to do work for the common good. It's always heartening to hear those news stories. At the end of Lester Holt's NBC program, for example, he talks about what inspires us today, and often it's about a young person who does something great. If we could recognize that in every parish and hold that up, it would be great. And it's a question, what would Jesus do is not just a trite slogan. It really means something. How would Jesus treat another person? And all we have to do is look at those children at the border, and we know what's happening is wrong. And then the value of our volunteering, the projects and so on, it relates to community, to belonging, approval, service, satisfaction, and many, many of them do it. So whatever reasons they have for involvement like that, it does strengthen their identification with a church or with religion. It can. So then we can look at the relationship to Catholicism. Some are religiously disconnected, others unschooled in Catholicism, and some retain long-term relationships with generic parishes, that is non-ideological, and some are schooled in conservative or traditionalist Catholicism. So we'll take just a brief look at each. Again, think of all of the little slices of the pie we have here. We have so many different factors that we need to bring to our attention as we try to serve in our own parishes. So first of all, the studies show that U.S. Catholic teens are less likely than Protestants to pay attention to their to the beliefs that they have. The 5 to 25%, it would be the 5% would be some of the more mainline, and 25%, the evangelicals, and 25% lower than the conservative mainlines. Catholic teens identify less with the way their parents have been than because they haven't learned from their parents. We're 2 generations away from when Catholic culture prevailed. So they're disconnected. They just aren't involved with the church in the same way that many of our Catholic, non-Catholic brothers and sisters are. Some are religiously disconnected. Religion is an external authority or a tradition that makes authoritative claims that they don't believe in. The question of science becomes an issue here. In the St. Mary's study, what showed up is that so many of the young people said they don't believe in the church's teachings because what's in the Bible is just all made up stuff, and who could believe that anyway? They don't have any sense of how much the church has done with science, how much the church knows about science and incorporates it in its teachings. We need to do a better job. Seminaries have been involved with trying to do that a little bit better, but it seems actually detrimental to developing a true and authentic morality. They believe if you are told what to do, that you have to figure this out for themselves. So a person who writes very well about this is Christian Smith, identified here at the bottom. That book, Soul Searching, was about teenagers, and it was written in 2005. He has a newer book called Souls in Transition, The Religious and Spiritual Lives of Emerging Adults. And that's 2009. He brings in the new factors in the culture that have caused people to be more disconnected from their faith: technology, economics, education, and the political scene. So many things have exacerbated the situation that already existed. Then some are unschooled in Catholicism. These figures here really shocked me in this sense. Some 58% of millennial Catholic teens attend public schools. Well, that's 42% who attend Catholic schools, pretty good. In the study of those who have left the church, in St. Mary's study, 8% of those students were in Catholic high schools, compared to 42% who are in Catholic schools, 58 in public. So 42% of those who stay in the church up to the age of 18, compared to 8% of those who did not go to a Catholic high school. And a similar kind of figure with slightly higher numbers exists for the elementary school. It says a lot about where we have put our money as a church, and yet the cost of high school and keeping schools and all the problems associated with that make that a very difficult factor. The teaching authority of church, they're less likely to regard it as important. And on issues of sex, sexuality, and gender, only 7% agree with the teachings of the church. And then 87%, I mentioned earlier, would like to end the male-only priesthood. So we're dealing with a series of factors here of young people who don't know a lot about the church and yet have very strong feelings against some of the teachings. And then fewer are raised in families who value ideologically non-aligned parishes. I really made this up, and I haven't read this any other place, so I'm sort of testing it out on you. But I'm from a farm, grew up on a farm, rural area, rural Minnesota. Lots of the rural areas of this country, the people in those parishes they know each other. they're often not particularly ideological. A lot depends on the pastor, but it's just their place to be. They're still cultural Catholics. They're in church because their neighbors are there and they're missed. They value pastors who embrace anybody, and generally they're not insistent about certain customs, and they usually welcome other people. A big challenge for many people in the rural areas now are the many Hispanic workers that are coming into those areas to work. So, but we're in the larger cities where many choices of parishes are available. The parishes tend to be more ideologically aligned and therefore more divided. I don't know what you think about that, but that occurs to me. And then some are schooled and deeply schooled in a conservative or traditional Catholicism. We'll see in a moment that it's really 7% of young Catholics who feel this way. A small group, they tend to say that learning about their faith is essential, very important, that Christ is really present in the Eucharist, that studying religion is important, and the traditional devotions and so on. It's a small but can be a very dominating group. On your paper that I handed out, this little slide, that slide is on there too, because I think it's important. Just to help you read it for a moment, this is a study that was done by various kinds of research, often through CARA, but it was done on the right-hand side. You see in 87, 2005, and 2011. So what we see there is in 87, there were no millennials, obviously, and by now, it's 23% of the population. So we're talking about a fourth, and probably that was 2011, so it's probably up to even 30% now who are of that younger generation. Many of Catholics are in that generation. Then look on the left-hand side, looking at the level of identity, low, medium, and high, identity with the church. These studies have asked about 10 questions and ask people to answer, and then they give a rating, and they get on a scale of low to medium to high. So just to show the extremes of the millennials, low involvement, maybe a couple times a year going to church, and high involvement, 7%. And virtually every seminarian is in that 7%. And then a few of other really dedicated young people. But they're very different from the average person of that age group. And the almost 50% in the middle, at least there's some hope there. That high percentage where it's very low, where do you start? And that's the challenge, because we just don't have a very big group to start with in terms of trying to evangelize, but that's quite shocking. The top line after pre-Vatican II, where a third of the people were highly dedicated, and now they're only 10% of the population. So this is why, when we say, why are young people leaving the church? It's because they're not identifying in the ways that we've just mentioned. So just a couple more slides on this. So the religious practice, generally speaking, we say they're spiritually hungry, they like experiences, and they like images. So hunger is not just for answers to spiritual questions, but for knowledge of how to find answers for themselves. In teaching undergraduates all these years, what I tell them at the beginning of the class is there is no question that's off the table, and we will discuss and, if necessary, argue, go back and forth. I'll let you know what the teachings of the church are, and I will let you know what some of the variations are that are possible, but we'll talk about what your issues are, why you feel the way you do. And usually when I start the class, about half of them I used to be Catholics. And of them, by the end, at least a few, every semester, will say, I've really changed my mind. I think I can still make it with the church. So they have that sense that when they ask questions of some religious authorities, lay as well as clergy, they're told an answer, and they don't want an answer. They want to discuss the issue. That can be really tiresome, believe me. But it's absolutely necessary, and I think it's our only way that we can get into their minds if we will listen to them in that way. Again, they love experiences, personal subjective experience based on authentic religious truth. They like some like spiritual direction, retreats, centering prayer, those sorts of things. And image-focused, they prefer images to discursive style. religious examples, the visual richness of icons, etc., vestments. They love vestments. Incense, just as you do. Incense, candles, etc. They love the stillness and time suspension of Eucharistic adoration. And once in a while, they're found out. I'd ask in class, I say, how many of you like to go to Eucharistic adoration? And like 7 or 8 hands will go up out of 20 or 30. And so I say, well, tell me why. Well, it's really a good place to do your homework. It's so quiet. But then others will say, no, that's not a very nice thing to say. So they get in their own little argument. But there are multiple reasons for doing certain things. They don't like beige Catholicism. Okay, there are some reflection questions on that section, and that's on your paper as well. Now moving on to the part that I better hurry up and do. This is about what I think the paper should really be about, and it's how we can help young people, how we can work with them effectively, and this is gathered from lots of places. So we learn about their characteristics, invite them, prepare those who will minister to them. Youth ministry is one of the most difficult ministries, partly because the young people who go, they're usually young people who go into it, they are often not really well prepared or prepared in a certain direction only, and they quickly leave because there's no way of moving up. I think there are some solutions to that, and working with several parishes together and so on, you can do some interesting things. So preparing people and then supporting collaboration among all those who do that kind of work in parishes. So these are a few generalizations and a few reminders. So cautions and concerns. The tendency to describe the attributes of only white middle class. That has been a strong tendency in the past. We're really getting over that. And then oversimplifying or generalizing, and I've talked about what some of those differences are, then overlooking important characteristics in rapidly changing times. Their issues change from year to year, and certainly from 5 years to 5 years. So what works in a parish 1 year may not work 2 or 3 years later. So looking through their eyes, each generation has its own unique way of animating the vision of what they experience as spiritual and religious. We need to adapt and adopt to what they see that way. The meaning of religious symbols and religious practices and so on are not necessarily the same for them as they are for some of us who are my age and younger, like most of you. And that is, they think of the rosary, for example. That's coming up in a little bit, I'll just save that. But so the meaning that they attribute to these practices may not be the same that we say they're just trying to go backwards. That's not it at all. They don't even know what backwards is. So the thing is that what they're trying to do is to make some sense of something that is important in the church and to see how that would apply to the present time. However, to them, the Second Vatican Council is as distant as the Council of Trent. And when some of them haven't done their homework, they will talk about Vatican XI. They don't know Roman numerals either. So we are really dealing with a group of people. Even their parents weren't alive, by almost their grandparents, at the time of the Second Vatican Council. In seminaries, the current seminary faculties, by and large, were young children at the time of Vatican II, and the older ones were taught by, only the older ones were even taught by people who were of the Vatican II generation. So the emphasis on Vatican II that has been mentioned here so many times is just lost, and it's lost in parishes too, especially by the younger ones who don't pay much attention. Here's where Pope Francis comes in so importantly, who has brought this back to us in such wonderful ways by reminding us of the wonders of the Council and of the kinds of teaching that have brought the Church alive. And I will say this about young people and Pope Francis. Among the undergraduates, they are, I would say, crazy about the Pope. They just really like how he talks to people and all of the kinds of things he says. They follow him, and they like him, the tweets and the Twitters and whatever else he does, and that's very good. Among seminarians, it's another story. Among many of them, they prefer previous popes. This generation, however, they do not and cannot look at the church and the Mass and everything else in the same way that we as older Catholics do. So help listening to them, getting a sense of what this means to them. Here's the examples of the Rosary, for example. They may see that as a protest. So they would protest, hopefully at something like the immigration problems. They certainly do it with against abortion and other things. They use the religious symbols in a way that shows that they are standing up for some very important values. Eucharistic adoration, sometimes it's a retreat to from a noisy world, but sometimes it's genuinely love for Christ. And I think, perhaps my fault, another confession, I may not think well enough of their sincerity about some of those devotions. So it's a good question to examine ourselves on. The older generations, ours, may consider certain practices retro, but they don't. These younger people see these ancient customs that have memories of a rigid church for us, but not for them. Mary Johnson has written about, Sister of Notre Dame, Dana Moore, has written a lot about young people. She's taught in colleges a lot. So the past has the potential to crush our future if we don't address it. So if those of us who come from the past keep crushing the hopes and dreams of young people, it can just simply cause it to collapse. So we don't want to do that, obviously. So we need to understand how they process information. They are not used to waiting. A 12-hour delay in responding to an email is an eternity, and if you didn't care enough to respond within a half an hour, you don't care about them. So please answer. And an attractive image-filled interactive web page is far more effective than a lot of print material. And they respond to some of those. Of course, there are so many things available now, it has to be really the right thing. And that's very difficult to do. And again, this I've said before, but not to lump everyone in the same place. They are not clones of each other, and especially now to be mindful of the multicultural church which we have. In no time, if not already, less than half of the of Catholics are Anglo. Now I'll move to the last part and go through it rather quickly, but you'll have this information available on the website in the PowerPoint. I believe they're going to put that on, and also, of course, the talk will be there. But I found some material about saying why millennials say they are over the church, they don't want it anymore. So that's in the little box. And then I'm suggesting a few things that one could do to respond to that problem that they have. Nobody listens to our input. What could you do? Use forums, surveys, meetings to discover the needs. We need to seek their views, not to just hope that they might say something. They won't, because many of them are kind of shy around religious people. You can't accept or do all the things that they request, but at least we can listen to them in those settings, and they appreciate that sort of thing. Don't spend so much time talking about values and missions. Sorry, was it Bob this afternoon speaking about the mission, the importance of mission? Churches do that a lot, talk about mission. They say, get to the point, and the mission is clear. Love God, love others. So get to the heart of the gospel, do something, do actions. Sometimes they're better at saying that than at actually doing it themselves. Help the poor and provide opportunities. Young people do seem, thankfully and hopefully, to care a lot about the poor on the whole. Many want to do something that will actually make a difference. So they want to spend less time on meetings and find out what the problem is in their local area that they could really respond to. And with them, create some kind of a pattern of what could be done. They don't like the church or religious people blaming everything on the culture. Well, they're not very good because we have a rotten culture that all this pornography and everything else is bad. The messes are there, but let's focus on our own community and see what we can do to clean up those problems. So they're very practical in that way. Avoid cliques. This is really important for after Mass. I'm very conscious of this, and you all are too, I'm sure, but the same people tend to want to speak to the priest and leave everybody else aside. And priests who are good pastors, which I'm sure means every one of you, that you have a way of saying, oh, it's nice to see you again, and then say hello to the person that's new, or that you don't know so well. It doesn't usually come past. But this notion of cliques and breaking into that for young people, that need for community and their need to connect, if they're left on the periphery, they are simply not going to be feeling very welcome. This goes to your wonderful treasurer. I'm not sure where he went, but yes, okay. Transparency, you mentioned it this afternoon, first thing. They want transparency about resources to explain their use and their misuse. And they want to follow Christ in the practice of his example of a poor person. And so how to do that? Make financial records readily available, create an environment of frugality. I thought that was a really interesting point. Not be, you want to be generous, of course, but not to have the best of things for people in the parish who are always there, and then never mind those who are on the outskirts. But that's important to them. And then best way to use resources and seek the advice of young adults as well as other parishioners, of course. And then think of yourselves as mentors. I just finished reading 65 grants to the Lilly Endowment to how to improve being pastors. And one of the things that came out so often is the notion of mentorship, that young people love to have mentors. I realize that pastors can't be mentors to a half a dozen or a dozen or 3 teenagers or young adults, but somehow in the parish there's a need to set up some system that they can be mentored, that they can be, some attention can be focused on. Adult mentors that are part of the church can be part of this. A pastor doesn't have to do it all. And something that pastors do that I know of, ask millennials and others, what is it that you find in the Sunday readings that you think I should preach about? And they get really good ideas. In fact, a priest, now not so young, but did his doctor of ministry degree. I supervised it, and he did his program was to see how young people responded to the request to be involved in the planning of homilies. And he said it improved his homilies very much, and he really was successful in his parish and still is. Help them feel valued. Don't just talk to them when you want something done. I do that a lot. Let them know that you believe in them, encourage them to go for their dreams, and go out of the way to thank them when they do something. Don't we all love to be thanked? And then talk not just in homilies about controversial issues. To say something in a homily and there's kind of no back and forth, but a space where they can talk about these things. And this idea of asking professionals in the parish to offer a session or two in their areas of expertise. It might be family finance, it might be something about sexuality, it could be any number of things. And the parishes that I know that do this, the older adults who are the experts love to be asked very often. Sometimes I think we just don't ask enough. And they want to know how to live a godly life, and they might ask you, what do I have to change to do that? So, and then improve the public perception of the church. 1/3 of millennials are anti-church, and those are the ones, I guess, okay, there. Yeah, connect with the neighbors and the community and make the church's presence known at school and public events. Then do something concrete about young adults. If it's working on plans, meeting with them, who are they, join in with other parishes, but do something is what they say. The tendency in these surveys is that a lot is promised and then nothing ever gets going. And then adapt and readjust to cultural conditions. So talking to millennials, especially the new ones, before they feel invisible. So when they get out of high school, past confirmation especially, that there's a connection that's made. That's very true with, I think I said this at the beginning, with older priests, with younger priests. Don't let them get into their little cliques and are separated from everybody else. Improve your understanding by looking up new information, and don't be complacent and irrelevant, or you will become extinct in the eyes of the young, as someone said. So those are some ways that you can respond to the complaints of the millennial young adults. Just to finish off then, ways to facilitate support. develop reconciling skills. I'm taking this from the Catholic Common Ground Initiative, which I've been part of since its beginning, and then also from a daily examen, seeing all sides of an issue, listening to it, to understand and not to find flaws, contribute your best ideas, and don't keep defending something that's a bad idea. That's easy to do. Evaluate yourself rather than criticize others. Young people like those kinds of things. And then this is from Ron Rolheiser, cultivate the virtue of resiliency. We will have, believe me, as we all know by our age, the hurts and disappointments and injustices in life. If we dwell on those and we do not dwell on the love of God for us, that is shown in so many, many ways every day, it will be hard to go on. So we accept the difficulty and the hurt and we move on. And we change from hostility to become hospitable, and to be sure that our resentments don't become acidic in our parish or in our groups. And then recognize the reason for the hope. The first book I wrote about seminaries was in 1989, and the title of it was Reason for the Hope. Liturgical Press now wants the titles of books to be what they're about, so I wrote about priests serving more than one parish. It was called Priestly Ministry in Multiple Parishes. The last book I wrote was about seminary formation. It was called Seminary Formation. How uncreative. But this was the title, Reason for the Hope. So I'm asking myself, what are reasons for hope that come to mind? Think of your own answer. Generosity of young people, growing ranks of the Catholic population. Look on the back of your sheet, from 47 million to 71 million in 50 years. Your experience of ministry. Think of, many of you have mentioned to me, the weddings that you've done, the funerals, the experience of changes of life for people where your presence has been extremely important, and our conviction of God's unfailing love. And I can't help but add to something else that gives me tremendous hope, and that is Pope Francis, all that he writes, and to the wonderful new bishops that he's appointed, some of whom are here, and those he's appointed to higher offices, even better. So we have lots of things to be hopeful and thankful for. And so we make a covenant of our life. This is from Father Vince Hovley, who was a Jesuit at Sedalia, Colorado, still giving retreats at the age of 80-something, to find a heart to face our future without fear, with great hope and trust that we are in God's hands, the heart to call down the flow of God's holiness and grace, to plunge ourselves into the Passover, to find a heart to pledge ourselves as bread and wine poured out for others, to live our call so as to share the fullness we desire for ourselves with others. So that is my hope and wish for you, and thank you very much for your attention this hot evening. Okay, Dan asked me just to begin if there are questions, and he said 15 or 20 minutes at most, and I'd be glad to take private questions later if you'd like. But as a group, we'll continue for about 15 minutes if there are that many questions. Yes?
Looking at the big picture. Looking at the big picture, do you have any comment on some of the huge events in our culture that have taken place? For example, Woodstock, for example, soccer leagues, Little League,
Right.
And how that has taken over the family and our culture. Mm-hmm. What kind of effect has that had on what we're our subject tonight?
Right. I think there are so many things that attract and distract people from their faith and from practice of their faith. Just at the table, we were talking about the Sunday morning soccer practice. Soccer is everywhere, and why does it have to be on Sunday morning? So it has affected a lot of things. When you started mentioning the big cultural gatherings, I was thinking of the youth gatherings that are worldwide and so on. That has an interesting effect that I don't think is that can be quite good, but it doesn't have a long-lasting effect with many of them. However, for some, it does draw them in a way, as those who went to Woodstock, who are now, 60 or 70 or 80, don't ever forget that experience. So more power to them, and to those youth rallies, to the youth gatherings that are held. But I think we have to find ways of gathering people that are interesting and exciting to them, but don't take away from their worship time. And yes, culture just does not do a lot to help us with the faith. And then we see now in the public culture the disregard for religious values that is so damaging. Actually, that might actually help our faith, because people see what happens when the destruction of religious values hits our society. Yes.
There you go.
Okay.
You mentioned very briefly that so many of our young people like Pope Francis.
Yes.
But not so many of our young seminarians
Right.
prefer previous popes.
Yeah.
Do you see an improvement in that, or are you hopeful in that? Because I think some of our younger priests tend to be on the clerical side. You know what I mean?
Yes, nicely put. I think that the young men who are being ordained or have been ordained in the last few years really came into the seminary system and found their vocation before Francis was on the scene at all. So they were attracted by perhaps different aspects of our faith than what Pope Francis is putting forward. And what he's putting forward is pretty challenging. I have taught first-year seminarians for all these years, 26 years, and the last class that I taught, I would say, was slightly more favorable, but the others didn't particularly like that I was assigning readings from Pope Francis. Like the second year he was in office. The first year, it was the middle of the semester. It was too late to assign that in a way. But after that, it was getting a touch better. I want to be a little hopeful. But I think that until they're mentored, see, those coming into the seminary nowadays are still from families that are much different from what Pope Francis is making most important. So I have a little hope. I always want to have a little hope. Yeah. Thank you.
At our table, we were talking somewhat about the homeschooling phenomenon. I'm here.
Okay.
The homeschooling phenomenon, and you know, it has some good things in it, but is it a new form of separatism in the church? I mean, there are many good Catholic values. They like the devotionalism. They know their faith, and many of these students, and not every place has the homeschooling, but a lot of places have it. Do you think it's a danger for the church? Should we encourage it, or is it mostly a separatism that we should kind of work against?
Yeah. Well, that's a very broad question and a little hard to make a judgment about it that I haven't studied it carefully, but I do have little experience. About 15% of seminarians are homeschooled. Yes. And they tend to have a difficulty in public presentations, speaking up, engaging in class discussion, etc. I don't want to say that's universal, but it tends to be that direction. So there's that dimension of it, but then what is the content of it, and who are those who are providing that homeschooling, and what is their knowledge of the faith, and to what extent does it have the breadth of our very wonderful faith? You know, is it an inch wide and a mile deep, or is it an inch deep and a mile wide? In other words, a little bit about not very much, or a whole lot about one thing or certain things, and skipping a whole lot of other things. The engagement and the questions of their peers and the challenges of teachers who are not their parents. I think that it has to be done extremely carefully. I know they're making some improvements in it, but I think that it has to be really carefully monitored. Certainly as a pastor, I would not be encouraging that. I would just say, you know, you have to think about these questions and make up, you know, but again, not making up their minds. Or if they're asking you because they want you to say yes, you know, why are they asking? It would be a good question. Yeah. Thanks.
Not so much at our table. I guess two reflections from me would be, one, we had a speaker at one of our convocations in our diocese, and the speaker said, for those of us in our age bracket, we were raised in seminary with the documents of Vatican II.
Yeah.
For the younger seminarians in our diocese, they were raised on the Catechism,
Yeah.
not on Vatican II. So they don't even know some of the stuff that we're talking about.
Right, right.
Second, that you had said in terms of conflict on Sunday mornings or Saturday nights with
Right,
things,
yeah.
We also have, in my opinion, we have to look at what we're offering on Sunday mornings.
Absolutely.
There was about 6 months where I had surgeries and I couldn't celebrate Mass, so I went to Mass.
Yeah,
I was bored out of my tree.
yeah,
I really was. I mean, I wouldn't have gone back. I
Yeah.
really, if I had to do that,
Yeah.
I mean, the homilies and the music
mm-hmm,
and the
Right.
language in terms of placating an angry God,
Yes.
which was still stuck with in
Yeah.
so many of the prayers.
Yeah.
I mean, why would I want to go back?
right.
And the homilies were more pious platitudes
Mm-hmm.
that went 15 minutes about nothing.
Right,
Sorry, guys.
yeah. Yeah, well, my wonderful colleague, Michael Jonkis, is here, and another former wonderful colleague, Ron Bowers. I don't know if he's here, back there. Anyway, now working in the Santa Fe Archdiocese. But if you went to their masses, you would go every Sunday, probably twice. But it's true that for a variety of reasons, our celebrations aren't what they might be. I did this study of multiple priests with multiple parishes, and now almost half the priests are involved in that kind of ministry, and probably more than half the parishes. At the time, it was about a third. That was 10 years ago. But in surveying 1,000 of them and visiting about 100 in their parishes, you realize how difficult it is to respond to different kinds of congregations and to move from place to place, and then to have somebody who can even play middle C on the organ. It's very hard to have good music. So I don't blame it entirely on the pastor by any means, but what we have to teach seminarians more effectively is to make use of the gifts of the people in the pews, of lay people who are willing to help with that. And even in terms of the homilies, the kind of suggestion I was making about asking young people, what would have meaning to you? They love to hear their ideas fed back. So there are millions of things that can be done. I've done a survey of how liturgy is taught in seminaries, and I won't go into the conclusions now, but it could be better, let us say. We really have to improve it. You're so right. We have to have something to offer them. We have the ultimate to offer them, but they don't understand that without a whole lot of background that we aren't providing.
The question that your statistics didn't in some ways deal with is the young people and voting and their involvement in that civic responsibility.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And connected to that, you talked about service
Yeah.
and their interest in service. What would happen if the federal government said, as some other nations do, that there was mandatory service once you turned 18? You could join the military, you could go to the Peace Corps, you might do something with your church or synagogue or mosque.
Yeah.
But so since there's interest in service and about voting and saying, would they support mandatory service of some sort for everyone once they turn 18?
Most interesting question. I think that mandatory service idea is one that could add a lot of positive things. On the other hand, it could be negative too. And one thing about young people is they do not like to be forced to do anything. And, I spoke glowingly of their qualities and desires and hopes and so on, but sometimes they just plain don't want to do it, whatever it is. And so I think they would not vote for it. A sense of, I want to do what I want to do is stronger at this point. I mean, obviously I don't know, but that's my thought. Anybody else want to disagree? I'd be happy to hear the reasons why. Or anything. Okay, some more questions?
In
Yeah.
working with young adults over here, sister, over to your.
We have,
Oh, okay, yeah.
In working with young adults, how do we demonstrate that we are authentically safe as priests? And then how can we continue our own personal maturation?
Oh, boy. The thing of being safe was a question that was never even thought of in the past. And so now, of course, it's the forefront question for a lot of reasons. Either that you aren't giving out information that you believe, that you are just doing this because the church says you have to do it, that you're not authentic, that you are a spokesperson for something you don't believe in because of other ways you behave. Let's say in luxurious living or certain kinds of interaction with people and lack of kindness and all those sorts of things, that makes a person, any person but a priest too, seem unsafe and someone they don't want to associate with. So I think, how developing our own maturity. I'll be 77 next month, so I am sort of at the end of trying, but it's a lifelong thing, and I'm always finding out things about myself because I'm in a community with people who really care for me and are not at all hesitant to say, when you gave that talk, I really wish you hadn't said A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, and so on. No, generally they're supportive, but people will say to us. So I think for priests, and Cardinal Supich had a wonderful talk at the beginning of the NFPC. It was a videotape thing because he was in Rome at the time, but about bowling alone and priests bowling alone, the idea of living their lives too separately. And in that study that I did of the priests in multiple parishes, they were often 50 miles away from the nearest priest, or 100 for that matter, miles away. The technology, the media, social media helps to keep in touch in a way that wasn't possible, but there have to be friendships among priests. Another D-Min dissertation thesis that I directed was a priest from Sioux City, and he wanted to know what difference it made if priests belonged to a support group. And he had 3 or 4 different kinds, and Jesu Caritas was his favorite. And then priests didn't belong to any. He surveyed all the priests. And the ones, regardless of the type of group, they were equal in being really happy with their priesthood, generally speaking, and satisfied with relationships. The only ones who were unhappy and disgruntled were those who had no community of relationship. And why that was, I don't know. But I thought that was a telling kind of thing. So you have to have people you can talk to and spout off and say things that are on your mind, whatever it is. So I think that helps a lot with maturity. Continuing to read, go to retreats, spiritual direction. I mean, there are a whole panoply of Catholic practices that we are so blessed with. And finding just the right ones. We can't do all those things, but finding the things that help us to grow. And that's what I would suggest. And it might be that you ask the people you serve, how is it going? That's something that's not done very much that can be helpful. You get more support than you'd ever think from that. Okay, they're in the middle, or there's, okay, all right.
We have a new music minister in our community, and he's done a marvelous job with both the cantors and with the children's choirs and with all of the people in church. His music is very stimulating. And I was impressed particularly when the acolytes who serve at the Mass began to sing full-throated response. And to me, that's just one of those marvelous kinds of gifts that are shared.
Mm-hmm, right.
That they come out on their own.
Yeah, great example. Thank you.
I'm from New York, and
The light is right.
there was a problem with our bishops going way back. I think it was the beginning of the first term of the leading up to the election of Barack Obama, and the bishops took a very strong stance. And Peter Steinfels, after that election, had a column in the New York Times. And he said, the big losers in that election were the bishops, the Catholic bishops of the United States. They backed abortion rather than any of the social issues. And if you look, they used to get coverage in the New York Times. At the bishops' meetings, they got good coverage. You could search in vain for any coverage in the last several meetings that they've had. And our people have reacted to that. So there's a confusion, there's a lack, they feel a lack of leadership. And that has led to some of the problems that you had on the board, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of the things that, I'm sorry, one of the things that do the young adults, or do adults feel that the church cares for them? We forget that before Vatican II, most of the Catholics were either Italian or Irish, or they came here and the church helped them. In fact, they even had politicians that took care of them to make sure they got the bread or got what it. But the church, I think, is too safe today. We saw what happened to the evangelical church. They got co-opted by the government to validate the government's play. And so the question I want to ask you, why is the church playing it so safe today? Are they teaching at all anything about social justice? That these men of tomorrow have to maybe get in the streets, get their hands dirty? Like a good concrete example, I just retired, but I had a big school. And anxiety was the biggest issue in that school of the young kids, because they were dealing with repressed fear. So here the people are in the streets marching. Did the bishops say to all their pastors, you got to speak out against gun violence? At least get the assault rifles off the street. So we don't say anything. We almost put our finger up in the air and say, is it safe now to come out of the closet and say something? And I believe very simply, the very is why is because very practically our basic financial base are Republicans. And so I'm not going to be political or anything like that, but I'm saying is
I noticed that right away.
I'm not Democrat or Republican. I'm like Jesus, I have no party. But so what I'm just saying is that if we're going to relate to the young, they got to know that we care for them because we're willing to stand up with those issues. Where was the church when the kids in South Florida marched? Were they leading the march? Were they going to the representatives? We got to get back in the streets with the marchers today and say, we are with you, we care for you. Because if we don't do that, they're going to say, you're not speaking to our hearts. We know it's true because we took care of the Italians. We took care of all the immigrants that came in before Vatican II. That's why the church was blossoming. And we forgot what it was all about. Our ancestors in the church got in the streets and took care of those who came in and made their life better and gave them hope.
Yeah,
So
I think
we gotta have that.
what you're saying, there's a lot of history that we have. The bishops and like all of us, each of us, are individual people. Many of them are courageous. Some of them we would wish would say more. Sometimes, a lot of times, I wish I were more courageous. And don't each of us wish at times we were more courageous? So I think we have to do what we can, and we have to pray and follow the Spirit. And I am not in a position to judge others about those kinds of issues. So I think we have to hope for the good of people who are suffering. And however that can be brought about is what I think is very important. One more? Okay. Yes. Yes.
Hi. Before I retired, the last parish I was in, St. Gabriel the Archangel in New Orleans, which was largely African American, but not entirely. I started young adults group, and we had young adults in who were in their 20s and 30s. We had about 15. Most, all of them, I think, were single. I think we had one that was a married couple. And they would have socials, and we would have prayer together once a month and so forth. And they got discussing why they couldn't get more young adults like them coming to church. And some of them said, well, you know, when they come to church, they don't see any young adults up there, you know, in the sanctuary and so forth. A few of them are in the choir, a couple of them were lectors, but that was very occasionally. So I said, well, why don't we do this? Supposing on the first Sunday of the month, I would give just a 5-minute homily, and one of you would then share your reflections after that for about 5 minutes. And we would do that every month, and each of you would have a turn to do that. And they said, fine. And that's what they started doing. And so they felt a great deal more of involvement, and I think it was a great blessing. The parishioners loved it.
Good.
I don't know what kind of effect it ever had, but anyway.
Right. Well, thank you for that very
I think
good
it was
example.
good.
And I think we can find ways, some that work and some that don't. And I wish you all Godspeed and many blessings of the Spirit on your difficult and wonderful work.